All right, and we're back. We're doing COMP228. Let's just go over the PowerPoint slides to make sure that we've got everything kind of all good. We've covered most of everything that I wanted to cover today, but I wanted to go over some of this. Actually, build a tip calculator. Let's talk about that, and I'll put the slides up later on. So we're looking at lesson. Actually, back from lesson 9. We covered some of this already. So I want to make sure that I've got everything. So swing builder, we got to the point where we got to the demo, which is here, demo time. And then I want to come back and talk about some of this. Okay, so we're going to build a tip calculator app as quickly as we can in the next 20 minutes. Let's see how we go. This tip calculator app, by the way, in Deedle and Deedle books, is built in Android, also in iOS, and they built it across different systems. So if you know how to build it on one, you know how to build it in the others. And it's kind of a neat thing to do, right? So let's take a look at this thing in terms of components. This is what you're going to see. You're going to have a bunch of different components here. So you're going to have a one part of the tip calculator is going to look like this: the initial GUI with the amount, some kind of slider, the tip, the total, and a calculate button. That's all it's going to be. So B, after the user enters the amount, so let's say, for example, 34.56, and you can slide the percent of the calculator, he can get the tip amount, which is 15%. So a tip calculator, right? Very easy. And then the total will be 39.74. Take the amount, the total, add it to the tip, and then to create your total. That's what it does. That's what the tip calculator does. Very simple. Okay, and part of this lesson, after user moves the slider's thumb to change the tip percentage, so I change it back to here, it can modify, it modifies these, the tip and the total. And when you click calculate, it'll do that, right? Okay, cool. So that's what what they build in the book. They use the same principles we just talked about here. This is the good thing, right? Oh, of course I didn't style this page. Why not? You know. And of course, it's not. I don't know how I missed that one. That's just weird. Anyways, so what we want to do is each cell in a grid pane can be empty or can hold one or more JavaFX components, nodes, including layout containers that arrange other controls. So, for example, other nodes, other containers, all that kind of stuff, right? The app here, it uses a grid pane and to arrange views into 2 columns and 5 rows. So here's 2 columns, column 1 and column 2. And 5 rows, right? And it says to learn more about class grid pane, visit the JavaFX layout grid pane, HTML, and so on. So we're going to have text fields, sliders, buttons, and we're also going to use this class called number format, which is a Java text class that can format locale-specific currency and percentage string. So, like for example, and they do this with every app they build, Deedle and Deedle, right? So if you use the Android app, and if you go to Greece, they'll have euros, right, as opposed to dollars or whatever it's going to be, right? So, and it's kind of a best practice, if you will. GUIs are event-driven, and we've talked about how to drive events by using the controller piece, right? So again, 3 pieces: the fxml files that keep track of our controls, how they lay out, which is our layout basically. Then there's the you have your CSS, the format, how it looks nice, and then of course you have the last piece, which is your control, which is how the controls work together. Again, it uses this whole idea of this model view controller pattern, design pattern that we just talked about, right, to split out the view and the app's processing logic, the controller. We haven't talked about the model. The model is when we kind of we're going to do that next week when we talk JDBC. All right. So how we create a model with our JavaScript, our Java, and we talked about this so we use the event handlers in the controller class. I'm just going to make sure that we've hit everything. Now they use the remember I kind of do this idea of FXID creates the property for the ID, so we can target that particular control. If I put an FXID, just like I did here on my app, the one we were building. So if I go back to the fxml piece, this fx::id creates the ID or the variable name for that particular control. That's what it does, right? FXID. The other one is the one I also use style class creates a new class called message, the message class. On HTML, this should be equivalent to putting the class attribute inside of your line. Okay, so instead of style class, it would just be called class in HTML, right? But here we're using style class, so we can use the CSS application.css to target it. Okay, so same ideas that we've been talking about. By default, the grid pane contains 2 columns and 3 rows. That's the default. You can add a row above or below an existing row by right-clicking a row and selecting grid pane, add row above, or grid pane, add row below. Now, this only happens in the scene builder, and it only happens if you want to use the scene builder to create your stuff. We've been trying to do a combination of 2 things. And again, if I go back to my scene builder view, and if I kill this for a second, right, and I go back into my Eclipse, and I right-click on my on the file that I want to access. So, which is, you know, example, this Testicular fxml. If I go to open with scene builder, you'll see how my my view has been updated, right? Okay, so here's my enter a message. But notice how also one thing to note is it's inaccurate, right? Enter a message is massive. It's like 40 pixels, but here it's showing it like here. So that's wrong, right? That's why I'm not a big fan, and I never have been, of drag and drop UI stuff, unless, I'll have to be honest with you, you look at Visual Studio. Visual Studio, what you see is what you get, pretty much, right? Within reason. And I like building my UI, especially when it comes to Java and JavaScript especially, and all those kind of things by designing it and then kind of you know, delivering it that way. Okay, so I've closed that off. So that's the next piece. So you could add elements by dragging and dropping. We've been adding them in here physically in the fxml file, which is more control for us. Same thing with Android. If you drag and drop stuff in Android Studio, Android for Eclipse, you'll get some weird ass errors sometimes, right? It doesn't do stuff the way you think it's going to do it. Okay. So that's what it's doing here. It's kind of dividing how many columns you can add. So you can say grid pane, add row above, or grid pane, add row below, and you can actually add stuff in there by, like it says, by right-clicking on a row and then selecting grid pane. Okay, so let's try that out. So I'm going to go back to Scene Builder, and I'm going to kind of right-click here and open with Scene Builder. And let's see, even though if this is incorrect, I want to add a row above. So I'm going to right-click here, and let's see, grid pane, and then I'll say, I don't have the ability to do that, right? Let's see if I can do that again. So here, grid pane.
You should click on the grid pane.
Grid pane. Add row above or below here. Right? I can only do that, right? But if I do that, if I do above or below, so I go grid pane here, add row above, I can do that. It splits it off like this. And if I go grid pane, add row below, it adds it the same place, right? Because in the grid pane,
You get the first row selected.
Yeah, so if I go here or here, so I'll only undo. And that's good. So I want to add another one below here. Add row below. There we go. So that's how that works, right? Again, our message, even though it spans, like notice if I click on my enter a message, my message says if it spans or not, right? So if I go back to properties of this text message, it should tell me that if it's spanned or not. And unfortunately for this one, if I go back to code, it does not. By the way, look, here's my FX ID. It's right here in the code part. It shows my message text as my FX ID, right? If I click on the button, it shows me my click me button button handler is the one that I've defined in my controller, right? And how have I linked my controller file? How do I link my controller file to my fxml, right? I gotta do that somewhere. So I'm gonna go back to here for a second and let's take a look. On the top of my fxml file, I also have this area that says fx controller is my namespace, tip calculator, and the name of my file, which is tip calculator controller. So that's the way I link or bind my controller to my view, right, to my fxml file. Okay. Now again, I'm styling it like this. Here's my application. This is going to change where I say my font family is Consolas, as an example, and my style for my text itself, right? So I'm saying I'm targeting that one text, message text. I'm targeting it with 60 pixels. It's not showing it physically in my on my UI. But it doesn't mean that I can't modify everything else. Now, when I modify stuff like I showed you guys earlier, so let's say I want this design, and it's showing a 2-column by 5 rows. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, exactly what they're asking for in tip calculator. Right? I can do that. When I do this, and if I save, if I go File Save, it saves my changes back. And sometimes, like I mentioned before, it's not what I want. It does this now, right? And I add a bunch of other stuff here. Take a look at this. This I need to keep now. I have something called column constraints here, spaces for it, and I also have row constraints here. And notice how I have a min height and prefix height here for my first row. This is my 0th row. And the same thing goes for my row constraints for the bottom of my row. I have a predefined height or minimum height of 30 for both those things, and the min height of 10. So some constraints that I built in, and if you notice back to my, if I go back to here, and if I look at my grid pane by clicking on the left here, I could certainly size these by hand and make things a little better. Like for example, if I want more V-gap or whatever, I can certainly do that by clicking my grid pane, going back to properties, right? And taking a look at some of the stuff that we've got down here, right? Let's take a look at some of the other stuff in my advanced layout. Here's my layout bounds. My bounds in local, bounds in parent. Okay, as an example, my layout bounds are right here. And I can choose maximums and minimums by choosing one of these options in the grid. My size, 238 by height, 131. As an example, that's my grid right now. And it's a 4x5 layout. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2. But I have more than two columns here. Remember that my enter message actually spans, right? It spans multiple rows, multiple columns, right? Enter a message. And if I was to show you that, and if I go grid pane, increase row span, or decrease column span, or increase column span, I can do that. So if I want it to go another column, I could do that too. Okay, PowerPoint. So that's one thing we can do. We build the apps UI, right? We can add the label by dragging the label from the library to the controls, and we can do the same thing with the text fields and the slider. And then you want to build the UI first, and then you want to start naming them. Okay, so this is the way they do it. If you build the tip calculator, they do tip percentage label. That's what it's going to be called for this particular label. And notice here in the design view for the tip calculator that they've labeled everything that they want you to do to create this this UI, right? So for the next few minutes, what I want you guys to do, you've got 5 minutes or so, right? I'm not going to build in the smarts behind it, right? Because the smarts happen down here. Right? This is where they actually do the calculations. Notice how in the tip calculator class you have this @override, right? And inside this is the main class, right? That extends application, right? And that you load your tip calculator fxml file, and you do some other stuff. Like for example, you can set the title of the window to stage.setTitle to tip calculator. Let's do that really quickly before I leave control to you. So I'm going to go back to main, and notice how I have primary stage, because we've generated this thing with our scene builder from scratch, right? So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say primary stage. This is in my main.java, by the way. Primary stage dot, and I want to set title for my window. This is the title bar of my window to tip calculator. One thing we didn't do. We haven't done a tip calculator. We just kind of created a grid for now, right? And if I run this thing the way it is, I get this, right? So here's my tip calculator message. I still have this functionality where whatever I type changes, and that's good. That's good interactivity right now that you can play off of. Okay, so that's what this thing does. And I'm not going to touch that for a second. Then, let's make this a little smaller. Again, we attached to the scene. We talked about how that works, the UI and the tip calculator class. And the set scene places the scene into the stage. That's what it does, because the stage is almost like your application. And your scene is a screen that we're looking at right now. And you can have multiple screens by attaching more than one scene to an application. Okay. And this is what it looks like when it comes to the tip calculator controller. Here, an example is they use big decimal. We covered that earlier this semester. We use math to calculate more accurately accurate numbers with big decimal. They also have some other calculations where they add in things like now notice how it says beans value. That's not us. That's beans, right? When you say beans value and so on, that's just the stuff that they're using. But one of the things that we can totally use is things like this. They've created a number format where the currency is equal to a number format get currency instance based on where you are in the locale. And we use big decimal for the tip percentage because we want to be as accurate as possible, right? And the big decimal is a special class that they use here across the book for calculations, right? But here's where we bind our controls, just like we did last time. So we use at fxml, which is this filter, or this decorator is what we want to call it in different languages, right? This at decorator binds our private field to our UI, right? And it has to be the exact same name. Please be careful with that. If it's not the exact same name, you're going to get a disconnect, right? Okay, cool. So once we've done that, we do some calculations, and then especially here in the private text field, we've talked about that. I want to show you where it is, the next piece. So here's my tip calculator controller class. They do a try catch in this particular case, and all they're doing is their calculations here. So when we made this private void, and we made it public, they made it private in the book, and they also used this at fxml to bind this particular event handler, right, which is part of action event to the calculate button. That's all they're doing here. Remember, it's just like an event handler in JavaScript. If I have an event handler in JavaScript, I say, add event listener, and then I mention what the event handler is going to be. The event listener is going to be the type of event, right? The action event is the action that makes sense for that particular control. So for example, for a button, it's a click event, right? Now there's others too, like a hover event and so on. All the same events we have in other languages are available here as well. And all we're doing here is, this is how it calculates the tip by getting this get text method that we used in our example in our app, right? It gets the text, converts it to big decimal. That's what it does, right? After it converts it to big decimal, we have the amount. And then to get the tip, we get the amount, right? And we multiply. We have amount.multiply, a special big decimal method. All of these things are big decimal because they have to be compliant, by tip percentage. So we multiply it by tip percentage, and then we get the total. Total is then equal to amount add. We're adding the tip to the total. So it's very accurate, and big decimal is an easy way of using calculations for banking and that kind of monetary calculation thing. Here then, after we've got the decimal, we use our tip text field .set text to set the currency, and we use a currency format method to format the tip into the proper currency, whether it's dollars or whatever. That's what we're doing. We're using the currency format to wrap the amount that's coming in, and we use that, we send that to the text field that's in our tip text field, all right? And the same thing with the total text field. Total text field, we're going to set text in the right currency format. If there's an error, we're going to say, as an example, here's the exception, amount text field, set text, enter the amount. It's going to clear out the text field. It's going to use the select all method if there's any kind of problem. If you've entered in the wrong information, like you entered in, instead of numbers in the text in the tip, you put in some kind of character. It's going to just take you and say enter amount again. It's going to zero that out. And we're going to use the select all method of the text fields in order for us to do that. Request focus, what it does is it highlights that text field back again. So it moves the focus back from wherever you had it, the focus being where your cursor or what's highlighted, what's active, the active control. It moves the focus back into that control, which is the text field, to make that the active control. And that's what this little calculator does. It's very, very straightforward. Here's the initialize method that they use, right? And again, it's called by the FMX loader to initialize the controller, right? And here what's happening is this public void initialize method is part of the the JavaFX event lifecycle. Okay, that's what it is. Each of these application has something called an event lifecycle, and there's different built-in events like this initialize event that triggers, right? And for example, this one, currency.sent round mode, we're going to round up, half up, right, as opposed to half down. That's a currency method that we're using. And now our tip percentage slider, the value property, we're going to add a listener to it. This is the old way of doing it, by the way. We're going to be adding a listener, and this is a notice how we're adding in a listener which is a new changed listener. That's a new type of way of doing it with an anonymous listener that's inline. That's what's happening here, right? So our tip percentage slider, right? What's happening is it's targeting this tip percentage slider dot value property dot add listener. We're adding a listener to the value property of the tip percentage slider. Whew. Right? Yeah. I wouldn't have written it this way myself. I probably would have used the same methodology in JavaFX to do the slider to make the slider work, right? But it uses the @ override to say that when the value is changed, then what we want to do is we want to change the value for the tip percentage depending on how much we slide our slider around, right? And we use something called an observable value, right? Which is a generic class that extends number. Now, this is something we haven't covered before, right? Yeah, because remember, this is chapter 24 in the book. So this is kind of going ahead. Let's talk about JavaFX. But that's it in a nutshell. First, you create your UI, and then what we do is we control our UI with our controller class. Okay, so very, very simple. So from now on, be aware, we're going to get the next day, we're going to talk about some kind of next assignment for you guys when you come back, right, from when I see you next week. And it'll be after we do, I'm not going to give you an assignment before we do our little tests. So remember, the stuff we're going to be talking about is the stuff in this PowerPoint as well as other PowerPoints after we did our midterm, okay? So what do we cover just before we leave for the day? And I'll update this PowerPoint up online for us. If I look at our lesson plan so far, our midterm, we did cover a little bit of swing before the midterm, but I didn't cover swing on the midterm, right? So you might have a little bit of swing, right? Then we're into JavaFX for the next couple weeks. So we just kind of did, last week we kind of did an intro. This week we did kind of more. But between the UI stuff, that's going to probably be covered. Things around swing and the difference between swing and JavaFX, those kind of things are going to be covered on this next little quiz, okay? So read chapters that are related to swing and JavaFX. And if you look at the outline for a second, let's take a look at that. We're like about a week behind, but we're going to totally catch up. I've taken my time with some aspects of things and rushed others. If you look at some of this stuff here, then our JavaFX basics happens in chapter 25, right? That's when it happens, the JavaFX basics, right? So I was wrong, Java is 25. And then the UI stuff, right? Layout managers and all that stuff happens in chapter 12. So we're not going to be covering anything in chapter 10.9. It's only chapter 12 and chapter 25 that we're going to be covering for next day. Okay, so those two chapters, little minor little chapter tests, because it's big stuff. Like we cover, like UI is like really involved, and there's a lot of stuff we can cover within the UI. So please, it's a good chance for you to look at the work again, and please study before we get together the next day. Okay, again, it won't be on, remember, it'll be on the day of. So the day we get together next week, Tuesday morning, that's when your test is going to be. It's not going to be this at this time frame. Okay, any questions before you all go take off? No? You're good? See you later. Thank you.